Hello, I'm Jim Falk, and thanks so much for watching today's program when we're going to be talking about democracy, a concept that I bet that all of you consider to be an essential ingredient, if not the bedrock, of what is often called the American experiment. And yet now, like never before, more and more Americans doubt whether or not it might even survive. Loudly and frequently, increasingly, we hear that democracy is under assault. In fact, recently, President Biden, in a speech about democracy, mentioned the word 25 times in just 25 minutes. The most important issue that Americans feel now facing the electorate is not inflation and jobs, it's democracy. But is democracy truly under attack? What do you think? Well, we're going to talk to a distinguished professor from the University of Texas at Austin, Jeremi Suri. Dr. Suri holds the Mac Brown Distinguished Chair for Leadership and Global Affairs at the university, where he's professor in the Department of History and the LBJ School of Public Affairs. He's a prolific author. His newest book is Civil War by Other Means, America's Long and Unfinished Fight for Democracy. And he co-hosts with his son, Zachary, a podcast, This is Democracy, which recently celebrated its 200th episode. Congratulations on that, Jeremi, and welcome.
Thank you, Jim. It's so much fun being with you, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
So let's just begin with this, because there are sort of different interpretations of what is the definition of democracy. How do you define it, especially in the American context?
So I define democracy as three key things, Jim. First of all, it's participation by citizens in their own governance, or the phrase we often use, self-government. Second, democracy involves opportunity. People should have the chance to change their lives and how they live, what they do. It shouldn't be that you're stuck in a particular kind of profession or a particular kind of lifestyle. Third, in addition to self-governance and opportunity, democracy is about some hope for prosperity, what Thomas Jefferson called the pursuit of happiness, the belief that people can live comfortably and should be able not only to choose how they're governed and have economic opportunity, but also to live comfortably in one form or another.
So how did our founding fathers view it? I mean, does your definition coincide with what they saw?
I think so. I mean, it's obviously modernized to a different world. But when Thomas Jefferson writes about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, I think this is what he means. And he talks about the consent of the governed. That's the whole justification for the Declaration of Independence. Abraham Lincoln always said that the Declaration of Independence was the foundational document, even before the Constitution, chronologically, but also analytically, in understanding what we mean by we the people and who we are as a society. That's the whole point of the Gettysburg Address, which of course goes back to that particular document.
Now, as I mentioned in the open, you are indeed a prolific author. I think you've probably written at least 11 books, and most of them have focused on national security. Why this book, especially now?
It's a great question, Jim. This is a very different book from the other kinds of books that I have written, as you said so kindly. I have to say, as I discuss in the opening to the book, my life was changed. The way I view these issues was changed by what's happened in the last 4 to 6 years in our democracy. Foundational to any understanding of national security, as you know better than anyone, is a sense of stability at home and a sense of who you are. Our brand in the world as the United States is democracy. And if we aren't a stable, secure democracy at home, if our democracy is in crisis, which it has been for the past 4 to 6 years, that undermines our foreign policy more than any missile system that the Chinese might develop or any aggressive move in Ukraine that Vladimir Putin might take. Watching our society go through the struggles of the last 6 years, particularly January 6th, 2021, and the insurrection, the attack on our capital by our own people, that led me to search in our history for where this came from, because I'm sure, like all your viewers, we recognize that Donald Trump might be part of the problem, but he didn't make this problem. This is something deeper. And I have to say, Jim, even as a historian who had written so much on our society, I hadn't thought deeply enough about these issues, particularly the legacies of the Civil War, which is what the book's about, that are still with us.
We'll come back to January 6th, but you're using very strong language when you say 4 to 6 years of crisis. Let's be more specific.
I think in the last 4 to 6 years, a significant part of the American public, nowhere near a majority, but a significant part, has undertaken actions with the intention of bringing down our democracy, to overturn an election, to use force against peaceful citizens simply asking for basic access to rights, to deny people citizenship who have a right to citizenship. Even what we're looking at today, to take immigrants, we can have controversies over who should get into the country or not, but to use them as pawns.
Don't you think that some of the guardrails are protecting us from this?
Yes, I think our institutions have proved remarkably resilient. The Justice Department, and I have a lot on the Justice Department in my book, which is created after the Civil War, created by Ulysses Grant. The Justice Department has prosecuted more than 900 people who stormed the Capitol. And I do think our legal system most times works. And we have other guardrails, as you say. But Jim, we cannot just rely on these guardrails alone. These guardrails are supposed to give us time to get the rest of our house in order. The fire department might put out the fire, but that doesn't mean you keep setting fires every day in your house.
Yeah, but you're also seeing, at least, I hear what you're saying about at the federal levels, particularly with the Department of Justice. But when you look at state and local jurisdictions, some of them are really trying to push back, as well as creating some of the valid points that you've made.
This is absolutely true. And as you know, Jim, my wife is on the city council in Austin, and every day she goes into work and does everything she can to, as you say, enhance and protect our democracy, often despite what the governor of the state is doing. So I think there are heroic efforts at the local level, but Jim, they're inconsistent. The things that are done in some places, the opposite is done. We have some places where parts of Wisconsin, for example, where people are harassing election workers and local authorities are allowing that to occur. We had a set of activists in San Antonio who were physically attacked by right-wing groups of one kind. So I think it's not to diminish what certain local forces are doing, but it's inconsistent right now in our society.
Well, let's move away for a while from what is happening today and ask you to put on your history professor hat and go to the book. What are the linkages, the ties that you see between the Civil War and what we are experiencing now, particularly with racial relations?
So I think race is at the center of the continuities from the 1860s and 70s to where we are today. The end of the Civil War is the end of slavery, but it is actually a new boost for white supremacy, because without the institution of slavery, other things need to be done politically, socially, culturally to keep certain people from voting, from participating, from having say. During the early years after the Civil War, there is an upswing in the number of African Americans, former slaves in many cases, immigrants, and others who are participating in our democracy. There are more African Americans elected to Congress in the late 1860s than there will be again until the 1960s. But white supremacy is used as a mechanism in many communities, North and South, to eject African Americans, to eject.
Let me stop you there just for a second and ask you to elaborate more on the Black officials who were elected, especially senators from Mississippi, right?
Correct. You have two. You have the first African American senators from Mississippi and South Carolina who are elected, and you have members of the House of Representatives, African Americans who are elected from all across the southern states. The irony, Jim, is that the parts of the country that later become the heart of Jim Crow are the parts of the country that have the most African American representation in Congress, in state legislatures, and other institutions after the Civil War, in that first decade after the Civil War, because all of these former slaves are now voting, all the male former slaves. And here's what we know, and I describe this in my book, and it's such a positive story. There is a hunger to vote among these African Americans. Some of them have come right from the plantation. Many have served in the Union Army, which is actually where they learn to read and write. And they are hungry to vote. They will walk sometimes 10, 20 miles in a day, stand in line in the heat in Mississippi or wherever to vote. There is no problem educating them on the importance of voting. The problem is many local communities where white citizens had been in charge for a long time. This is a radical departure. It's very threatening, obviously, and action is taken to make it harder. What do? In many cases, they create, in these communities, they create barriers for people to vote. The most obvious one being violence.
And is this in the North and South? Predominantly the South, I assume, but also in the North?
In the North to some extent as well. The one of the real challenges is that the Republican Party, which controls Congress, the Republican Party wants African Americans voting in the South because they will vote for Republicans. The white voters are still Democratic voters. But they don't necessarily want African Americans voting in Ohio and Illinois because the officials who are elected, the senators of those states, Senator Lyman Trumbull, a very powerful senator from Illinois, for example, he's been elected by a white constituency. He doesn't want a new African American constituency in Illinois. So you have this inconsistency, which is why, and this is one of the most important legacies, Jim, that is why the 15th Amendment, which is ratified in 1870, does not guarantee everyone the right to vote. All the 15th Amendment does is it says you cannot deny someone the right to vote based on race alone, but it allows you to deny people the right to vote for all kinds of other reasons. And that's a huge legacy, Jim. That's still a problem in our society today. We actively make it hard for people to vote and deny them the right to vote in Texas, in Florida, and states like that. To this day, in Florida, even after a referendum passed overwhelmingly giving felons back the right to vote, Florida is still preventing those who were felons, those who have served their terms, from voting again. That is, I think, hundreds of thousands of African Americans in Florida, just as one example, who are denied the right to vote. That is the same process that was used and revolutionized in the 1870s.
But still, there's got to be, and lots of Republicans who disagree with what you're saying. How do they base their arguments?
So the arguments against different groups voting are the standard ones. There are arguments that these groups are not qualified to vote. They shouldn't vote. They're not educated enough. I mean, one of the ironies, right, is that people will often say that certain groups shouldn't vote because they're not educated, but then they won't educate them, right? So it's another way of denying the vote. Fundamentally, our democracy struggles with the fact that we want people to vote, but we want our people to vote and not someone else's people to vote. And white supremacy coming out of the Civil War is a mechanism by which many groups, many that aren't even always explicit in their racism, use race in non-official ways to make it hard for people to vote. Gerrymandering is another version of this, where you put all the votes in one place so they don't have the same implications. You put all the African-American voters in one county seat, so only that county can have representation by an African-American. There are all kinds of ways this is done. This work, here's the point of the book on this issue, this work to deny people participation. This work comes out of the years following the Civil War. You don't have to do this during slavery.
Well, gerrymandering, of course, is a key part of that, but also the Electoral College. And I know you've taken a strong stand that you think the Electoral College should be abolished.
Absolutely. The Electoral College was a problem long before the Civil War. The Electoral College gives disproportionate influence to states that have very few people in them. The same problem we have with the U.S. Senate, and it creates this problem where we have a disjunction between the person who might have the most electoral votes and the person who might have the most popular votes. In 1876, I have a whole chapter on this. This is a huge issue because in 1876, with disputed state returns in Florida, in South Carolina and Louisiana, and even to some extent in Oregon, it's unclear who's won the electoral vote. We know who had won the popular vote. We know who had the most total votes. It was actually Samuel Tilden, the governor of New York. But of course, Tilden doesn't become president because Hayes is able to make a case that he won these disputed states. So even if he has fewer popular votes, he will have one more electoral vote. That is a real problem because in 1876, it means that the president elected has no legitimacy. People don't know this in most cases. We go until January of that year, till February even, without having a president. The inauguration time was March. It wasn't clear who the president was going to be. There were threats of war again, and a compromise has to be made, which in essence gives southern states freedom from civil rights enforcement.
Sounds quite familiar. And, we've done a few programs on whether or not the Electoral College should be eliminated on this program. And yet it really seems that there's never going to be enough support for there to be a constitutional amendment.
Well, I don't know. I wouldn't say never, Jim. I'll say this. By every survey that's been done in the last 10 to 20 years, the Electoral College is incredibly unpopular. I can also tell you, as someone who teaches 300 undergraduates every semester, I've yet to meet an undergraduate who defends it or even really understands it. So I do think a generation is coming of age now that is questioning whether the Electoral College should exist or not. And I think there will come a time when we have enough will to make a change in this. Whether we'll eliminate it, I don't know. But it is very hard to defend Wyoming having the influence in presidential elections it does, so much more so in some ways than states like California or Texas.
We'll see. I've just seen so many resolutions attempted to be put forward and not cross the finish line, cross the goal line. One of the questions that has always perplexed me, and want to take this opportunity to ask you, if Abraham Lincoln had not been assassinated so soon after the surrender at Appomattox, would things have been different?
Yes. Abraham Lincoln was not someone who had all the solutions to these problems we're talking about. No one did. And that's part of the point of the book. And it's a point you know so well, Jim. A war doesn't end just because people have signed an armistice. The issues linger for a long time and they're difficult to deal with. But Lincoln had a few advantages over Andrew Johnson. The first one being that he actually had credibility with his own party. One of the issues Andrew Johnson has when he replaces Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson was the only Democrat who did not actually secede. And that's why in the Senate. And that's why Abraham Lincoln chose him as his running mate in 1864. But he had no connection to Lincoln. He had no connection to the Republican Party. Andrew Johnson was a drunk, and the Republican Party didn't really have a method of working with him. Yet Andrew Johnson was in charge of the country as virtual dictator for 8 months, because after Lincoln's assassination, Congress did not sit again until December. Congress did not sit year round at that point. And so Andrew Johnson took all kinds of measures that ran against what the Republican Party, what Lincoln was seeking to do. He pardoned the Confederate military leaders, which never would have been what Lincoln would have done. Lincoln would have done two things very different, I think, from what Andrew Johnson did. First, he would have brought the Republican Party together, and there would have been some consensus, and there would have been quicker movement towards some set of probably moderate reforms. And then second and most significant, I think, Abraham Lincoln would have invested much more in African-American communities in the South. He believed these communities deserved a chance to to raise themselves up. Andrew Johnson did the opposite.
You know, we have just about another 7 or 8 minutes. And so often I hear many of the same arguments that you've made on both sides. It's easy to point fingers, but how are we going to come together in this country to get away from this hyperpartisanship, which I think we all agree is threatening our democracy to some degree?
Jim, this is why I wrote the book. I am a believer that change comes with generations. If you want to ask me the real engine of history, it's generational change. The best thing that happens in the United States is when a new generation, often different in its racial, gender, political makeup from a generation before it, takes control. Think of the difference the 60s generation made in our society and our lifestyles. Not all good, but a lot of really good things came out. Think of the New Deal generation. I call them that rather than the greatest generation, right? The generation that went through the Depression and World War II. I wrote this book, and I do my podcast, and I teach, and I do everything I do, Jim, because I believe we have a chance to get a new generation to do better. In the Jewish faith, we talk about lador vador. Every generation has an obligation to pass on wisdom to the next generation, knowing they will do better with that wisdom than we did. And so that's my point here. The main argument of the book is that there are some legacy decisions we've inherited, legacy institutions, and we can see them and we can change them. It's not just about who's president. It's about the institutions in our society. We need to roll up our sleeves, a new generation, and dig into changing these, getting rid of the Electoral College, changing the way we do voting, changing the way we think about presidential succession. I talk about all this at the end. It's hard, but I think it's possible for a new generation. Who would have thought that the generation of World War II could do what they did, what the GI Bill did, for example? Who would have thought that we could have a world today where gay and lesbian and other LGBTQ issues are mainstream? That was done by the generation from the 1960s, right? We can make these kinds of changes if a new generation doubles down.
But what about some of the inherent institutional challenges? Say, some would argue right now with the Supreme Court.
Yes, yes. Well, so I talk about this in the book. As you know, the Supreme Court, the Constitution doesn't tell us how many members should be on the court. It doesn't give us the court's jurisdiction. Congress can change that. I'm all for the rule of law, and I believe in judicial review. But I don't believe in 9 people in robes dictating to the country who can do what with their bodies. Congress can change the jurisdiction of the court. Congress can also change the makeup of the court. The founders never intended, Jim, for people to serve on the court for 50 years. Their perception was that you would be appointed to the court as a wise man in your 60s and you'd live about a decade.
Yeah, and you pass away before you were 70.
That's exactly right. And now, God bless, people are living longer, we hope. But 50 years Clarence Thomas has been on the Supreme Court since I was a freshman in college.
Okay, well, jump back and tell us about how the issues that Lincoln had with the Supreme Court.
Yeah. So Abraham Lincoln, one of the challenges he had is when he became president, the court was entirely dominated by Confederates. And so what did Congress do? They changed the jurisdiction of the court. They redesigned what the court could address. And then as justices died or retired, Congress changed the number on the court. So during Lincoln's presidency, the court increases to 10. Lincoln appoints 4, I think maybe even 5 justices to the court, and the court becomes Republican Union dominated. And that's important because then the court can approve of the things the Union is doing to start to win the war and rebuild the country. After Lincoln Lee is assassinated and Andrew Johnson replaces him, Congress does not allow Andrew Johnson to appoint justices to the court, and they shrink the court down to 8 justices. All of this is constitutional. All of this makes sense. I'm not for changing the court because of the flavor of the month. I am for the court standing by the law and being representative of our democracy. You cannot have a court, men and women in robes, telling the public that they have to do things that they do not recognize as within the purview of their democracy, or not do things that they believe are essential to our democracy.
But just, I guess it was about a year ago that President Biden, maybe almost 2 years ago, was one of the first commissions that he established to look at the Supreme Court. Great number of really well-known legal scholars, and yet that report is sitting on a shelf somewhere.
Right. And I've actually read that report, Jim. I'm sure you have. I think it has some really good ideas. And you don't have to believe in court packing. I'm not necessarily advocating that. What I am advocating is Congress doing its job, which is to make sure that it sets the appropriate jurisdiction for the court, and that it also creates a process by which the justices on the court are seen as legitimate. Whether you like or don't like someone who's been on the court for 40 years, the fact they've been sitting there for 40 years makes it very hard to believe that they actually represent what are the basic democratic interests of our country.
I think you're right that Americans are frustrated right now. And Pew did a survey fairly recently where 85% of those polled said that they felt that there needed to be a major change in our government. It was really quite striking.
I've seen that poll, and I've seen a few others. We've been in these moments before. This is what Americans said during the Great Depression. This is what Americans said in the late 60s. In fact, I think the numbers were even higher then, of Americans who felt that at the end of Lyndon Johnson's presidency and the beginning of Richard Nixon's presidency that we needed these major changes. Here I'll go back to Jefferson, right? He says the tree of liberty needs to be refortified every generation. That's an opportunity. That's why I wrote this book. That's why I'm optimistic. The fact that we recognize our society needs to be changed. You and I, Jim, can believe we might still have the best democracy in the world, but it's not as good as it should be. It's far from it. And it's time that we recognize the flaws and improve it.
In addition to reading your book, of course, what can we do? What can our listeners, our viewers do? I always hear vote, but what else?
So 2 other things in addition to voting, and I was just talking to a group about this before I came to talk to you. First, we need a better pipeline of leaders. We need people who are the best and the brightest and the highest of integrity of our younger generation. I mean, those who are in their 30s. We need, all of us who are in our 40s and 50s and older, we need to mentor and encourage those people to run for office or to go into public service. They can go into the Foreign Service. They can go into the Peace Corps. They can go into all sorts, and then go into teaching. But public service needs to be given a shot in the arm. We need to say that public service is the highest calling in our society. We need to respect it, and we need to encourage the best people to go into it. You know this better than I do, Jim. It's often said in Washington, policy is personnel. Well, look at our personnel now, and then think about what our policies have become. So that's the first thing, create a better pipeline. We need a better farm system, and all of us can do that. Don't support someone because you like their party. Support them because you like their integrity, their intelligence, their ability, their skills. Second thing I think we all need to do is we need to invest in discrediting the stuff that we know is bad. I'm not for cancel culture, but I am for arguing against and pointing out to people in every way we can that, for example, the 2020 election was won by Joe Biden by millions of votes.
And I guess a third point would be education, more investment in education, particularly civics, right?
Precisely. And that's just where I was going to go with that. So people understand the system. I'm amazed, Jim, how many people don't actually understand how voting works. They've been told to vote, but they don't know how it works.
Professor Suri, indeed, you are a distinguished professor from the University of Texas, and not surprisingly, you have strong views. And I'm sure there are other views and other perspectives that we need to hear, and you can be absolutely certain that here on the McCuistion program, we'll be continuing this series on democracy because it's too important to ignore. I hope we'll hear from our viewers on both sides of the discussion. And as always, we like to bring you different perspectives and talk about things that matter with people who care. Thanks for watching.